Moral self-consciousness, having attained its truth, it therefore abandons, or rather supersedes, the internal division which gave rise to the dissemblance, the division between the in itself and the self, between pure duty qua purpose and reality qua a nature and sense opposed to pure purpose. It is, when thus returned into itself, concrete moral spirit, which in the consciousness of pure duty does not give itself an empty criterion to be used against actual consciousness. On the contrary, pure duty, as also the nature opposed to it, are superseded moments. Spirit is, in an immediate unity, a self-actualizing being, and the action is immediately something concretely moral. Paragraph 634 is relatively short, and we're not really seeing the word conscience being used in this, which we would expect since it is in the title of the section. But there is some other Hegelian terminology that plays a very important role here that is somewhat obscured by Miller's own translation. And I don't like to knock other people's translations too much. It's a very difficult thing to do. Hegel, perhaps more than others. But in this section, there's actually some things that are being left out a little bit. And one of them occurs at the very end of this paragraph, where Hegel tells us that spirit is in an immediate unity. He goes on, the action is immediately something concretely moral. That something is actually the word Gestalt, which means shape, right? And we are talking about a new shape of consciousness. So we don't want to just say an indiscriminate something. We have a form or shape of consciousness that is an advance on the others. Now, why is it an advance on the others? Because Hegel actually uses the term Aufheben in its verbal form, right, at several times in this section. He talks about the third thing here, this concrete moral spirit. He says, which is in the consciousness of pure duty, etc., right? And it talks about superseded moments. Well, the supersession is Aufgehobenes, right? So they've undergone a process of Aufhebung that has produced a new Gestalt. And a little bit earlier in the section, he also uses Aufheben as well, where he says that, moral self-consciousness, having attained its truth, it therefore abandons, or rather, to be, using the correct term, supersedes. So here Hegel is talking about something very important for this section. What is it that moral self-consciousness has now started out trying on as a new shape of consciousness? Why do we have a new section? This is the question that's being answered. And he tells us here that we have finally figured out what the truth of moral, notice he doesn't say moral consciousness, right, or the moral point of view, moral self-consciousness. And the reason I bring that up, there's a little bit of a digression, but I think this is quite important, is in this section, particularly in the paragraphs coming up soon, and just a little bit before, we saw the importance of a term that first came up in the self-consciousness section, recognition, anerkennen, right? And we're going to see that playing itself out here. So it's not just moral consciousness or the moral point of view, it's moral self-consciousness, a moral consciousness that takes a stand on its own consciousness, on its own fitness to duty, to morality, to what it is that, the holy will requires of it, whatever it is that we're thinking about in this respect, however we formulate it. So that's an important point. Let's look at the text now. Hegel says, moral self-consciousness attained its truth, right? So it abandons, it leaves behind, or supersedes, brings along with it the internal division which gave rise to the dissemblance. And again, internal division, the division, Trennung, splitting aside, in sich selbst. And we could say that, okay, we've got an internal division. Internal to what? Well, it's internal to the moral consciousness, is it not? That's the important role here of our, phenomenological observation as the observer. We're seeing the moral consciousness try to be moral and end up splitting itself against itself. But all those parts are still moral consciousness. And Hegel brings up just two of the antinomies, right? Something that is in itself, an sich, right? Or something that is the self, selbst, right? Or something that is pure duty, Pflicht, qua purpose, Zweck, right? As Altzweck, or reality, Wirklichkeit, as a nature and sense. And we've got all these other ways of arranging it as well. But in the first section, the exploration of the moral self-consciousness, it was noting all of these things. And what we saw is sort of a plurality arise in what should have been a unity that we're going to achieve now in this current section. That led quite naturally to attempts to overcome this and then attempts to talk it away or pretend that it's not there. A dissemblance, a Verstellen. And so Hegel tells us that, here we go, the internal division, the division within moral consciousness gave rise to the dissemblance. The division between the in itself, the self, we don't have to go through all of that. And then he says, when it returned into itself, it is, and here he uses a term quite deliberately, concrete moral spirit, Geist. Right? So this is the spirit section. Self-consciousness is spirit in a certain sense. We saw this, again, going all the way back to the self-consciousness section, that being explored, right? Even before we got to, the beyond the master-slave dialectic and into Stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness, that was already part of the issue. Here, he talks about a concrete moral duty, right? Concrete moral spirit, which in the consciousness of pure duty, it does not give itself an empty criterion to be used against actual consciousness. Instead, pure duty winds up being part of a moment, a set of moments, rather. What's the other set of moments? Nature, opposed to it. And these are what he calls superseded moments. What does it mean to supersede moments? It means that they're still there, there's still considerations, but now they're part of a larger unity, an organic whole. What is the whole in this case? Is it the whole of society? No. It's the whole of the individual who has a conscience and who acts. Hegel uses the term Handlung here, which we can translate as Miller did as action, or we can translate it as comportment. So he goes on and he says, these are superseded moments. Spirit is, in an immediate unity, a self-actualizing being. In an immediate unity. What's the immediate unity? Again, the individual who is acting on the basis of conscience. And this is a form of self-actualization, of making oneself wirklich, right? The action, he says, the Handlung, is immediately something concretely moral. It is, the action itself is a new gestalt of consciousness. Suppose a case of moral action. It is an objective reality for the knowing consciousness. This, qua conscience, knows it in an immediate, concrete manner, and at the same time, it is only as conscience knows it. Knowing is contingent insofar as it is something other than the object. But spirit, that is self-certain, is no longer such a contingent knower, and a producer of thoughts divorced from reality. On the contrary, since the separation of the in itself and the self has been done away with, a case of moral action is, in the sense certainty of knowing, directly as it is in itself, and it is in itself only in the way that it is in this kind of knowing. Action, qua actualization, is thus the pure form of will, the simple conversion of a reality that merely is into a reality that results from action, the conversion of the bare mode of objective knowing, that is, knowing an object, into one of knowing reality as something produced by consciousness. Just as sense certainty is immediately taken up, or rather converted into the in itself of spirit, so this conversion too is simple and unmediated, a transition effected by the pure notion without alteration of the content being determined by the interest of the consciousness knowing it. Further, conscience does not split up the circumstances of the case into a variety of duties. It does not behave as a positive universal medium wherein the many duties would acquire each for itself a fixed substantial nature. If it did, then either no action could take place at all because each concrete case involves an antithesis in general, and in a case of morality, a clash of duties. And therefore, by the very nature of action, one side would be injured, one duty violated, or else, if action did take place, there would be an actual violation of one of the conflicting duties. Conscience is rather the negative one, or absolute self, which does away with these various moral substances. It is simple action in accordance with duty, which fulfills not this or that duty, but knows and does what is concretely right. It is, therefore, first of all, moral action qua action into which the previous moral consciousness that did not act has passed. The concrete shape of the deed may be analyzed by the consciousness looking for distinctions into various properties, that is, here into various moral relations. And each of these may either be asserted as absolutely valid, as it must be if it is supposed to be duty, or else compared and tested. In the simple moral action of conscience, duties are lumped together in such a way that all these single entities are straightway demolished, and the sifting of them and the steadfast certainty of conscience to ascertain what our duty is simply does not take place. Paragraph 635 is quite a long one, and there's a lot going on there. It's really, you could say, broken up into two main sections, the first part of which is centering on what conscience is in terms of action. And then there's this long discussion about duties and how they work, and can we have a multiplicity of duties in the second part of it. But these all hold together in providing us with a characterization of just what conscience is at this state in its development. And remember, we're talking about a conscience that has emerged from all of these rather complex dialectical reflections on morality, which itself came out of all these reflections on culture, which then also came out of ethical life. So we're at the end of a long process of development, and this is not meant to provide some sort of Hegelian, description of conscience as it is in every single person. So if you're saying, well, when I hear the still voice of conscience within me, I don't recognize this dynamic, you might not be talking about the same thing that Hegel has in mind at this point. So let's follow along with what he says. He says, let's suppose a case of, and here Miller is adding in moral action, and then that's not really a big problem to say so. He says, there's ein Fall des Handelns. Handeln here is action, comportment, right? And he just finished talking about this in the passage right before this. So we could read moral in here because we're not talking about tying your shoes. We're talking about something that conscience would be concerned with. So he says, think of a case like this, an action that we would do. He says, it's an objective reality for the knowing consciousness. And there you might say, all right, Hegel, what are you on about? Why bring in knowledge here? Isn't conscience primarily not about theoretical matters, but about practical matters? Yes, but we do have to know what it is that we ought to do and what we ought to do it with and how things ought to turn out and the reality that we're working with. And we could go on and on and on. So it's not so simple to extricate those. He says this, the knowing consciousness, qua conscience, as conscience, knows it in an immediate, concrete manner. And again, we've seen him using these terms, immediate and concrete, now for, this is the fourth paragraph where he's using this language. What is he doing? Isn't immediacy bad from a Hegelian perspective? It's always kind of deceptive. Well, yes, but we're not at that point yet. Concrete, though, is something generally good, what we want. We don't want abstract. We want the concrete universal, right? So he says, it knows it in an immediate, concrete manner. At the same time, it is only as conscience knows it. Now, that is a rather big claim, isn't it? What it is known only as conscience knows it, and it not only is only known in that way, it only is in that way. Is Hegel saying that unless we cognize something, it simply does not have any being whatsoever? I don't think we should go that far with it. But he is trying to say, in what matters about it, it's how we know it. So he says, knowing is contingent, zoophiligus, right? Insofar as it's something other than the object. What is he saying there? Well, insofar as my knowledge of something is of that thing, this book, for example, then I could not be knowing it. There's no reason why I have to know this book, or why you do either, for that matter. I mean, turn the video off, right? And then you're not knowing it anymore, or turn your attention to something else. It is contingent. It's dependent upon something else. But, he says, spirit that is self-certain is no longer such a contingent matter. When it's our own thing, then we know what we're doing. In a certain way, he's not actually like bringing up Descartes or Augustine or the possibility of deception here. Although, we just went through a whole passage, actually a whole section where we were talking about self-deception, weren't we? Now, conscience is convinced that it can't be wrong about what it's actually doing and willing and choosing. So he says, spirit that's self-certain is no longer such a contingent knower and a producer of thoughts divorced from reality. Why? Because the reality, the Wirklichkeit that it's working on, is what it's producing, right? It's not that there's a reality out there that then produces our thoughts, or that we produce thoughts to try to match that reality. We are changing that very reality. And here we should think back to how Hegel has treated similar processes in the past. Think all the way back to the reason section, right? We had reason having some sort of direct connection to its own activities. Did we not? This is bearing its fruit here in spirit, in the morality section. So he says, on the contrary, since the separation of the in itself and the self has been done away with, a case of moral action is, and then notice he brings up sense certainty, the very first beginning level of consciousness, in the sense certainty of knowing, directly as it is in itself, and it is in itself only in the way that it is in this kind of knowing. Why go back to sense certainty, this immediacy? Right? Why are we circling back around at the very end of the spirit section? Well, let's look ahead. So he goes on and he says, here's what I've schematized. Action qua actualization. So Handlung, comportment, action that we're choosing, qua actualization, für Wirklichkeit, making actual, making wirklich, making reality, producing reality, action that is that, right, is thus, he says, the pure form of will. What is it that we do with our wills? We will in many different senses of the term, as many great thinkers have pointed out. Anselm is, a prime example who I've brought up at different places, who talks about the will as instrument, the will as usus, or the instances of willing, uses of the will, and willing as the turning of the will as well, but that can also be brought under usus, or that can be put under the other category that he recognizes towards the end. You might call them dispositions, fundamental dispositions, or aptitudes, or affections, the affectiones of the will. And what do we mean by will? Well, all those different things, because the will is complex. Here, Hegel tells us that we're dealing with the pure form of will. It involves acting in such a way, and willing by itself is a kind of acting, by the way. It is an action, willing something to be the case, willing to produce something, willing to change reality. So then he goes on and he says, action qua actualization is thus pure form of will. The simple conversion, nice term there, the conversion of a reality that merely is. And he uses this phrase, ein seienes Falles, right? Something that just happens to be the case, to a reality that is the result of action. And a little bit, closer to the German, eine getane Wirklichkeit, a Wirklichkeit that has been deeded or done, right? From tun. So that's what's going on in action. We're taking reality that is the case, including ourselves, and we're making it what it is that we want it to be, what we will it to be. So he goes on and he says, here we go. The simple conversion of a reality that merely is into a reality that results from action, the conversion of the bare mode of objective knowing an object, into knowing reality as something produced by consciousness. In a way, we often picture the theoretical as having a greater priority than the practical. But I've pointed this out many times. For Hegel, the theoretical is encompassed within, or at least shot through, by the practical. What it is that we actually choose, produce, do, that is what allows us to know the reality that we're in part because it's our reality. We have produced it. And if we want it different than it is, right? If we're not happy with what happens to be the case, we have to act, we have to choose, we have to do, we have to will. And that's where conscience comes in, right? Let me put this down for a moment. Think about this. Conscience sees how things are, and sometimes it says, okay, this is great, let's keep on going the way it is. Just, keep the process moving. We'll do the same sort of actions. But sometimes conscience says, no. This has to change. Well, what's going to change it? Just thinking about it? Having some nice feelings? Or, writing a tract, tweeting about it? You got to do something. Now, tweeting could be doing something for some people, but generally, you actually have to put some figurative boots on the ground, don't you? Including your own boots. So, he goes on, and he says, just as sense certainty is immediately taken up, or rather converted into the in itself of spirit, remember what happened way back in sense certainty, so this conversion is simple and unmediated, a transition effected by the pure notion, the pure begriff, without alteration of the content. What is the content? The content, the inhalt, is determined by the interest of the consciousness knowing it. Now, what does he mean by interest here? It is about being interested in or curious about or caring about, but it's those things because it's interest in the sense of when we talk about one's own interest or self-interest, right? It doesn't have to be selfish, but certainly conscience is being motivated by its thinking that something really is for it. It's something that's its responsibility or its duty. So he goes on and he says, Conscience, this is where we get to the duty stuff, does not split up the circumstances of the case into a variety of duties, as we saw discussed in earlier sections. It does not behave as a positive universal medium, right? A sort of thing that everything else is floating around in, wherein the many duties would acquire a fixed substantial nature. And he says, why not? Why can't we have this many duties going on? If it did, then we would have a problem. Either no action could take place at all, because each concrete case involves an antithesis in general, and in the case of morality, a clash of duties. We saw that when we pose multiple duties, they wind up clashing with each other, and not just in a sort of abstract theoretical way. Live a real life, and you find out that your many duties often do clash with each other, right? Can't go to your kid's recital and do your job really well at the same time. There's, one example right there. And conscience would convict you in that case, right? So he says, therefore, by the very nature of action, one side would be injured, one duty violated. And then duty would be, in a certain sense, not duty, right? Or else, he says, if action did take place, there would be an actual violation of one of the conflicting duties. So here he says conscience is rather the negative one or absolute self, which does away with these various moral substances. It does not treat them as substances. It treats them rather as moments of itself, a higher unity, right? But a negative unity. So he says, it is simple action in accordance with duty, which fulfills not this or that duty, but knows and does what is concretely right. It sort of threads the needle, figuring out what the right thing is to do. Now, this is very optimistic at this point, I should point out. He says, it is therefore, first of all, moral action as action into which the previous moral consciousness that did not act. Why did it not act? Because it couldn't fulfill all these duties. There was a clash between pure duty and the many duties. There's clashes of the duties themselves. When it's a concrete being, it's able to act. So he says, the concrete shape of the deed may be analyzed by the consciousness looking for distinctions into various properties. Here, into various moral relations. And each of these may either be asserted as absolutely valid, as it must be if it's supposed to be a duty, or else compared and tested, put into a kind of listing of a hierarchy or set of priorities, or an ends and means connection, a teleological schema. Conscience, in this case, is what decides what counts as full duty. So it's not that there's duty and then, duty compels conscience. Rather, conscience is the thing that's actually deciding here. So he says that, here we go. In the simple moral action of conscience, duties are lumped together in such a way that all of these simple entities are straightaway demolished, and the sifting of them in the steadfast certainty of consciousness to ascertain what duty is simply does not take place. So at first Hegel's talking as if, well, conscience is going to take all this information in and kind of, prioritize it and think about it. No, it's immediate, remember, right? He's said this already. It's concrete and immediate, and it's going to decide what needs to be done in order to bring about something. And in a certain way, he is not saying this here, but this is something important to keep in mind. In its agency, it's leaving something out, isn't it? Now, what that is, we'll talk about that in a bit. But keep that in the back of your mind.